Hi, my name is Corey Weathers. I'm the author of Military Culture Shift, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to give you a little bit of background of why I wrote the book and a little bit about the timing of when I wrote it as well. I'm a mental health clinician by trade. When my husband joined the military in 2004, he was in the reserves. We later came in active duty in 2008. I knew with my clinical background that it was going to be my passion to serve military families, service members, and also military spouses, and it has been my joy to do so ever since. But I really love looking for patterns in relationships, looking for patterns in families when we're wanting to change an unhealthy pattern into a healthy pattern. I just really enjoy the dynamics. Some people in the clinical world would call that family systems work. And I also love to look at larger groups of people and the patterns that flow through the larger groups of people too. So in 2011, I noticed some shifts were happening in our culture. I had come in 2008 as a spouse when we were right at the peak. I didn't know it at the time, but at the peak of large amounts of funding coming in to support our force as we were fighting two global conflicts at the same time. So there was a lot of support, a lot of patriotism still since 9/11. And so coming into the military during that time was a game changer for me, really, because families really worked together. They came out of their homes to raise each other's kids. Like, we were going through suffering together. And it was a game changer for me in my perspective of people, my perspective of service, the service culture. And so in 2011, when we moved to Fort Stewart, I knew something had shifted in the culture. People were not coming out of their homes as much as they used to. People were not showing up for events. Something had changed. And about that time, I knew it was important for me to kind of just zoom out like I do working with families, but zoom out culturally and start watching for some of these patterns and these shifts that were changing over time. We have had many shifts over time, but now we're at a place where things are really starting to unravel. And I really wanted to collect all of these things that I had witnessed, all of the conversations that I've had over 2 decades, examples from the counseling office, examples from working with teams and units and leaders and spouse groups, and really collecting this cultural information over 15 years and doing the best that I could to put it in story form. Military Culture Shift tells the story of our military culture. Over 2 million people. That's a lot of people to try to tell their story. But zooming out, how can I tell the story of our culture and what we have endured, especially since 9/11? For those of you who hear that and think it's a Greek tragedy and sounds like a depressing book, in many cases, it is a hard story to listen to, much less read. Which is why I wanted to turn it into a leadership book as well. Whether you're a military leader, a policy leader, whether you're in academia, whether you're a clinician, whether you're a military spouse leader, whatever kind of leader you are, even if you're just an average American citizen that wants to understand what is the complexity and why are we struggling with recruitment rates, retention rates, and some of the issues that we're seeing in the military culture, this book is for you. It is a wonderful, beautiful story of the incredible grit that our culture has, how we have endured those 2 decades, and also the price that we've had to pay in our families because of 2 decades of war. None of us were prepared to endure that long of operation tempos and the stress that it asks of only 1% of the American population. So there's also wonderful leadership examples, great positive stories of the many leaders who have done amazing things, sometimes small things, sometimes big things that changed and altered the course of someone's life. So I wanted to, as I told some of these stories of decisions that were made over time, some of them good decisions, some of them not good decisions, I wanted to make sure that I also highlighted when leaders got it right. There's also in the back of the book leadership tips, questions for continued dialogue and conversation. There is plenty for you to learn from as I've woven in organizational psychology leadership examples and tips along the way, ways for you to look for your own personal cognitive bias, what keeps you, in other words, from seeing the person in front of you and seeing and hearing their story. But the main purpose is, can you hear the story of this culture over the last 2 decades? When people ask me, what do you want to say to America? What do you want to say to maybe the citizens that don't know what it's like to live in our world, in the military community? My answer is we are 1% and represent the larger American culture. We are a mirror of what America represents. If the values and the unity of our country is dissolving, of course that's going to trickle into our community as well. But we also, as only 1%, must shoulder the burden of protecting our nation, defending our nation, and being ready to get up and go as the nation or the president calls. And that is a tall order, but it is one that these amazing, gritty, wonderful, value-centric people that's in this community, that's what we live and breathe for, and we're good at it. We may be tired, we may be burned out, but it is what keeps us strong and it keeps us together. So if you are looking for a book on how to lead better despite the generational shifts that have changed in the workplace or in the military culture, if you're a spouse that's trying to understand what did I just go through in those 2 decades, if you're trying to understand how do we recruit Gen Z, how do we work under millennials who are now in leadership, how do we honor the older generations that have lived through a big portion of those 2 decades, this book is for you. I knew it was so important to get out now, especially while we're having a recruitment crisis, especially as we are on the brink of potential more conflicts for us to engage or support our allies in. As a clinician, my biggest desire is that you will read this book and be able to see people better, see the person in front of you as a person of value that has a story that's worth listening to, and that you might just lean in with a little bit more curiosity than you did before. And that, I believe, the connection, the curiosity, that is what leads to healing, where we find community, where we find cohesion, where we find each other's humanity, where we find the opportunity to be the best version of what humanity can be for each other. There's also a limited leadership series podcast called Military Culture Shift that is available, where we will continue these conversations in podcast audio form. I'm going to be bringing in interviews from people I've mentioned in the book, roundtable discussions, really just taking the concepts from the book just a little bit deeper, where you can hear that dialogue starting to happen, and hopefully it helps you also have similar conversations around your table or around tables with your colleagues. So I hope that you will subscribe to the podcast, and also in the book there's a QR code. On one of those first few pages there's a QR code that will take you to a page with extra resources, graphs, pictures, examples that will help the book come to life. So be sure to check out those graphs. So often when I teach this material, it's the visual example of seeing these generations as they're coming in on the timeline that makes everything make sense. So be sure to check out that link for more information, that supplemental information, and also the podcast. Thank you guys so much for reading, for supporting and sharing this project. I hope it brings you understanding. I hope it brings you hope and direction for ways that you can move forward as a positive leader that brings about change.